there was a real battle for my soul going on, you know, my entire childhood. Like I've always believed in God. Like I told you, I've never had the privilege of being an agnostic. I've always known that Jesus Christ is real and that, you know, he is real. And yet, I also knew this other stuff was real. And from what I could tell, the Christian faith wasn't able to account for it. So the whole time I'm growing up, I have this sort of tension. And one day I was about 16, I'm working in this boutique, and it was a rainy, dark day. And this bizarre person that I had never seen before came walking into the boutique, and he was dressed from head to toe like he had walked into a Hot Topic and they said, "What would you like?" And he said yes. He was wearing like the tight tartan pants. He had the big black chunky boots. He was the freakiest guy. And I grew up in the Midwest, so he would have been invisible in LA, but where I was from, he stood out like a sore thumb. He was tall. He was blonde. He had long, stringy blonde hair. He was incredibly pale, and he had pale, almost iridescent, almost like translucently pale blue eyes. And he comes into this boutique. He immediately locks eyes with me, and my first thought is, oh great, it's just, he's a creep, So I was standing at the register, and it was one of those really old-fashioned registers where you had to, when you had to count back change. And he's walking around this little boutique, but I'm thinking there's no reason for this man to be in here. There's nothing in here for him. This was a little kitsch shop. He walks around, but he won't stop looking at me. So I start grabbing, we had a price tag gun under the counter, and I'm thinking, okay, if he comes over here and he tries to do something, I'm gonna have to get him I'm gonna have to tag him with this price tag gun. But he comes over and he's going to buy this, I don't even remember what it was maybe a sticker or something, and he looks at me as I'm ringing him up, and he says to my face, he says my full name. He says, "I have been wanting to meet you for quite some time. It is so good to finally meet." And he knew my name. And the way he was looking at me, it was the most predatory, creepy grin. And I remember looking into his eyes, and there was something not quite right about his pupils. Couldn't tell you what it was, but like I said, his eyes were just so pale blue, and there was something almost sickly about him. I don't know how to describe it. But he handed me his money, and as I was counting back his change, I had to give him some coins. He grabbed my hand so that we made contact. I wanted to just drop the change into his hand, but he made a point to grab my hand. And the moment he did, a powerful electric surge went through my body from my feet up through my head. And I blacked out. I didn't fall, but I was frozen. I was sort of it was like I was being electrified. And I don't know how long that lasted, but when I came back to, I was standing in front of the register, and then he was leaving. And I have never had a category in my brain for what the hell was that.
The history of our Earth is so different from what we can imagine.
Enjoy the journey.
The Smithsonian, that if they found out about a large skeleton somewhere, was to go get it.
I'm going to assume at least one person is right, because if one person's right, it busts the paradigm.
It all goes back to the fallen cherub. And the problem with the modern day church, they have a very truncated view of the supernatural.
This backdrop that's just pregnant with all kinds of meaning associated with this Mount Hermon event.
Welcome to Blurry Creatures.
And this guy defects from the kingdom. That's a big deal.
Welcome back to Blurry Creatures. Sometimes we get the creature casserole, and today we're getting that. as our guest so famously put it at the end of the episode. You'll have to wait till the end to hear that line, but she said that, and I think it's fun. I think it's fascinating. I think it's 80s.
If a casserole doesn't take you back to the 80s, to riding your bike to the neighbor's house or to the corner store and coming home for a casserole, right? Like whether you were on the West Coast kids like us or in the Midwest or wherever you might have grown up, it wasn't nothing like a casserole. So you're going to get the Blurry casserole today. But this is going to be a really fun episode. Our guest is a member and a listener of the show, and she actually has an amazing testimony of her own life story of just kind of going all the way into the darkness and then returning. And everything from entities to sleep paralysis to out-of-body experiences and interactions in the occult, being a part of the occult, to being rescued out of that. This is an amazing story and account from Joe, and so we're grateful to have her on and to tell her story, and grateful she reached out, and if you have stories and you'd like to share with us, you can reach us at info@blurrycreatures.com. Shoot us an email. Let us know. We
might put it in the old shepherd's pie. We don't know yet, but we might.
It might be old mincemeat too. Who knows? Only my grandpa was the only one that ate mincemeat at Thanksgiving, but he loved it.
He loved it. Shepherd's pie was not bad. It was a weird casserole, but it was pretty good. I liked it. Did you have the green beans, mashed potatoes?
Just put it all in there. Mix
cheese,
it up. Bake it.
Ground beef.
Right.
At least that was the shepherd's pie we got, but today we got a casserole for you of weird stuff. And some people have it. Some people just have all the ingredients for whatever reason. And their story it takes a long time and many years to kind of put it all together, looking back at it. And I think that's the cool thing about the podcast, Luke, is that, it kind of gives people a sort of permission to believe their own story. Yeah. Like Daniel Duval said on a lot of our episodes, that's the majority of his work is like, hey, you've had something crazy happen to you. And so many skeptics in this world listen to this podcast, and I think there's the opposite people who are trying to say, get out of the skeptical mindset, try to help some of these people who've gone through these things and need a place to talk about it. So you're welcome on Blurry Creatures to talk about whatever happens to you. And like Luke and I oftentimes get a lot of critics in our channels, and I think one of the things I want to say is we wouldn't have a show if we brought people on that all believed and said the same thing.
Correct. About
all this weird stuff. There is no formula for the paranormal when it comes to our faith. And, people will say, oh, vet. But I'm like, we wouldn't have a show. We wouldn't have a place. We don't know. Not everyone who comes on our show will have to say this. So we agree with everything that comes out of their mouth.
Yeah.
Their theology, their thoughts, but they deserve a place where they can say what they've experienced without judgment.
Yeah, and I think it's not a novel concept, but the idea of, spitting out the bones. When you're trying to answer questions that don't have an answer until we have, when someone pulls a Bigfoot out of the woods, the best we can do is get the best answers, right? And with that example and with everything else, I think people's stories are so important. There are ufologists that have spent the last 40 years compiling anecdotal stories about abductions, right? And I think as a great friend of the show, the late Dr. Michael Heiser, we miss Mike dearly. As Mike would say, it's weird, it's important, and if just one of those is true, expand your paradigm and it breaks the paradigm completely. And I think, if you're going to be curious and you're going to ask questions about some of the hard things, the best we can do is try to get the best answers. That's why we're here, Nate. Try to get better answers.
Yeah. Miss Heiser, just thinking about it a little bit. But, a lot of us are here because of him. I think that Luke and I have been in a unique place the last couple of years to hear your stories and give it a platform to just put them out there in the world and people listen. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast, sharing it with friends, sending us a message, sending us your stories, trusting us with your stories. And if you want to become a member of the show, blurrycreatures.com/members. We are currently ad-free podcast. And I think Luke and I are humbled that people coming out of these just crazy situations in the occult listen to our show and put together some pieces to help them come back to their faith, come back to the story, come back to the King of Kings who rules over all of this, and understand for the first time what kind of war they're in. And I think Luke and I had no idea when we started the show that we would be putting some of these pieces together, but that's sort of a byproduct. So you can become a member. We get access to extra content and just to help us do this, blurrycreatures.com/members. And like Luke said again, info@blurrycreatures.com if you want to send us a message. Let's get Joe on this show. All right, everyone out there, welcome back to Blurry Creatures. Been a long journey for Luke and I. We started this podcast in mid-2020, and I think we've learned a lot together on this show. And one of the cool things about this podcast is people are coming along this journey with us. People who've been through a lot of blurry experiences of their own. We've had a lot of members come on our show and tell their stories, their testimonies, things they've been through. Today's one of those stories. A listener, Joe, she grew up around a lot of the blurry stuff and had a lot of experiences, sent us an email that was unique and I think a powerful testimony of what the show's meant to her and some of the things she's been through. So, Joe, welcome to Blurry Creatures. Thanks for coming on our podcast.
Thank you.
And and thanks for your email too, because a lot of times Luke and I do this and we sort of send it out and put it out in the cloud, and it often just feels like it's just him and I having a conversation with some of our friends, and we don't really know who's listening and what it means to them unless people tell us and give us some messages. So it's great to read yours. It's really encouraging because some of the stuff we talk about is very dark and no one wants to talk about it, and sometimes we don't even know what to say. And I think, but we want to give people a platform to tell their story, and that's what we want to do today. So thanks for coming on the show. And
yeah, we're great to have you. And it's kind of, we talked on pre-roll, Nate. Like I love this part of what we do, because what a lot of our show is, we talk to people that, the doctors, the theologians have 10,000 hours, but the other part of our show is talking to people that have actually lived the experiences. And so this is a really, really excited to have you on, Joe. And we know without a doubt now, 180 plus episodes in here, Nate, that like when we have people come on and share, that there are people listening this will resonate with, and this will impact, and it will be one of the cool things about this, Joe, is that while a lot of people think that their experiences, and a lot of times they haven't talked about, are makes you feel alone, the cool thing is that we inevitably have people reach out that have similar experiences, and this speaks to them. It ministers to them. It gives them permission to talk about this and to process some of these things, because a lot of people will just tuck these things away. And so we're grateful for you to have you on today. And because you are a member and a listener to the show, it wouldn't be right if we didn't start this out by asking you, what are your thoughts on Bigfoot, Joe?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on and listening. I emailed you guys because I think it was during the Laura Singer episode, you guys were discussing the magic circles, and then you guys took a little bit of a detour. And you were talking about, it's part of what makes it great. Just talking about like knowing if you're in the right place, if you're actually doing the work you're meant to be doing. And I just felt like, gosh, I've got to email these guys, because they need to know that if it weren't for their podcast, I wouldn't be going to church, and I wouldn't have repented and turned back to Christ. And so, I just felt like it was my job to let you know that I am one person. And I didn't even find your podcast until it was October, December-ish of last year. So I'm very brand new. But as far as, yes, thank you. As far as my thoughts on Bigfoot, I really haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about him. It's very sad. I've been kind of preoccupied with other stuff.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
But I listening to your podcast actually jostled up an early childhood memory for me. I grew up in the Midwest. We had a huge family estate, just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres. There was forest, there was meadow. We had a little canyon. We had creeks. And anyway, so all of us grandkids, we were cousins. We'd all run out there like the lost kids and just live in the woods. And I remembered in the middle of listening to one of your episodes that one day we were coming home from the woods and we found a huge footprint in the mud. And we were so excited. It was like, granted, it could have been just a man running barefoot, but he would have had to have had like size 16, 18 feet. Like a big old convict like Sheldon from,
yes,
Selden. Yeah.
From the Green Mile,
yeah.
Right?
It was a huge footprint. And I remember distinctly, we were all so amazed by it. We ran back to the house and we tried to get the grown-ups to come out and look at it. And of course, it was a bit of a hike to go back out there. And so we could only convince my dad to come and look at it. And when he got there, he accused us of hoaxing it. He didn't deny.
So it was real good.
Yeah. It was a really deep, big humanoid footprint. And to this day, he still maintains, you guys must have hoaxed that. It was so realistic. There's no way. And anyway, so I don't know anything about Bigfoot, but I do know that one time when I was a kid, me and my cousins, we all found a really, really big footprint in the mud.
You found a Bigfoot, a literal Bigfoot. Yeah, that's
the sign
amazing.
Of one.
I think that's a familiar theme.
Yeah.
People have these flashbacks as adults to things that happened in their childhood that they sort of wrote off or they didn't think about for years. And something about this show just sort of johns some of those things loose. I just want to say thank you for what you said earlier, just a few minutes ago too. Like, it's incredible to hear these stories. I don't know what specifically about the Blurry Creatures space allows people to rethink some of these things for the first time, but it is, and it does, and it's powerful, and it's cool to hear, because I think one of the things is, like, we put it out there. In some ways, we give you sort of the NC-17 version of everything, and you have to take it or leave it, right? There was this very profound thing that happened in Genesis that messed up the world for a long time. And it can help explain a lot of things that Christians just, for whatever reason, don't want to put into their paradigm. But when they do, they can kind of come back and make sense of a lot of these stories that, for whatever reason, the way that we've read them growing up, in sort of more of like a PG version, confused us. We were really confused. Like, I don't understand this story. Why did God do this and this? Why the flood? Why the Tower of Babel? Why Sodom and Gomorrah? Why all these crazy events? Why command these Israelites to go out and do who knows what to who knows who? And you walk away and you look for answers in places like the occult. Some people go to, the psychics and their friends, and they start getting mixed up in other things to get answers. When I think the biblical paradigm can give you all the answers you need, you just can't baby it. You cannot treat it like it's a kid's book. You have to read it like it's written. It gives you everything you need,
Absolutely.
So anyway.
Yeah, I grew up in the church. I was one of those young people who not only grew up in the church, but was active. I wanted to not necessarily be the best Christian that I could be, but I wanted to know my book. I mean, I was reading the Bible cover to cover. And even so, I didn't understand the Nephilim. I didn't understand Genesis 6. And it was, not because I wasn't looking at the words as they are written on the page, but it was because there was nobody that was explaining it. And so, yeah, the Bible was open before me constantly growing up. And yet there was so much that was, just not understandable, it seemed, or at least perhaps no longer applied to us today. A problem for then, not for now. So
yes, yeah. That's common, right? It's an easy way to dismiss a lot of things that make people uncomfortable. Is to be like, well, things are different, or we're just going to gloss over that.
Yeah, we're not going to talk about the genocidal activities. We're not going to talk about all of that. That was for a different time, and there was a lot that, to me, looking at it from my human perspective, it not only was inscrutable, but it seemed insane. So
I think a lot of people realize too that sort of read that like a time for then, but you got blurry creatures in your backyard. You have these things showing up, and there's a lot of people that experience the things that were then now. And what do they do? What answers do they have? And you're right. I think the church does people a disservice by not talking about these things, because there's a good quarter of the population that deals with this stuff on a daily basis.
Yeah.
In some way, shape, or form, and they don't know what to do. They're looking for answers in non-biblical places because the church is just refusing to talk about these things.
Exactly.
Yeah. And Joe, your story starts young. I kind of want you to you laid a good foundation talking about growing up in the church.
Yeah.
But I'd love to start with the things that began to happen to you as a kid, and eventually why you walked away. And this is a wonderful redemptive story, not to ruin and not to spoil it for anyone, but I think it's so important to start where you start in the beginning and kind of walk us through your story and how you ended up where you did.
Okay. I'm not exactly sure when it starts, but it must have started in infancy. I have a notoriously awful memory. Call it my amnesia brain. So if you hear me rustling papers over here, these are my notes. So I just have to have something in front of me so that I don't forget anything major. In fact, one of the hallmarks of sleep paralysis and astral experiences for me personally is I'll be almost amnesiac about it after. I may remember it right after, but if I do not write it down, it will be gone. And I will not consciously recall it even like a few days later. So even preparing for this interview, I was sort of scrambling because I was thinking, I know I've had so many of these sorts of things happen. I know because I have, the sort of the cloud, but I had to actually go digging through old journals and diaries to find specific examples. So yeah, as far as I can tell, it started when I was very, very young. And this is something that I have told many people. I've never had the privilege of being an agnostic. And I say that somewhat tongue in cheek, but for the lion's share, my young adult life, I actually envied people who could look at the world through a materialist, reductionist, evolutionary lens and say, well, this is all there is. Or even worse, they could look at the world and say, there is no evil. Evil is nothing more than a low vibration. And so if you spread love to the low vibration, you can bring that vibration up. And so there is no evil. There is just sadness or whatever. No, there's evil. I'm sorry. There is evil. I guess the earliest anecdote I have is a memory that I don't even have myself. It's what my mother relayed to me. I was at church and a bunch of kids, we were running around the gymnasium playing tag. I was maybe 6-ish. And all I remember is I was running full tilt across the gymnasium, running away from the kid who was it. And the next thing I know, I wake up and I'm on the ground and there's a woman kneeling over me. My mom didn't see what happened. She was told by the woman that she had seen a demon pop out of nowhere, grab me and throw me into the wall. And so I apparently lost consciousness. I hit the wall. And this woman, I woke up to her kneeling over me and she was praying over me or exorcising me. I don't know which. I wish that she was still alive so I could ask her. But my mom sort of was freaked out by that. And she was like, I don't know if I want you exercising my kid in the gymnasium on a Tuesday morning, And so, but that woman was very clear and very adamant that that's what she saw. And she was not a crazy person. She was an upstanding member of our church and our, local community. And then after that, I remember off and on some memories of just being hyper aware of there being unseen entities around me. And sometimes they were scary, sometimes they weren't. And there was this particularly tall, hooded being who did have red eyes, who would show up once in a while. And I have always been a writer. I am a writer. And so what I would do starting from a very young age is I would put these characters into my stories, and especially the scary ones. I would give them names, I would give them backstories, and I would try to make them more sympathetic so that I wouldn't feel so scared of them.
Joe, when you say unseen, you mean unseen to everyone else, but you're able to see them,
I can either see them or I'm aware that they are in the room. The room changes, but there was, I do remember this one, and I won't go into a lot of detail about the backstory that I created for him. I actually started working him into one of my stories at the time, and I look back on that now, many years later, and I'm like, if I had actually tried to get that published, that would have been a really good sort of oh gosh, he was, very Nephilimic, it was that kind of thing. He was creepy, but yeah, so I've always been hyper aware of these entities, these energies being around me. And I never really got any answers from our church and, answering the question of who they were or what they could be. I was just told, that stuff. We I wouldn't necessarily say that the church we attended was cessationist. I think that's the word, the belief that miracles are no more, there is no more speaking in tongues. But that was kind of the unspoken belief. And so to believe that there could still be angels and demons actively with us now in this realm affecting us, that was sort of woo. And so I was never told to be quiet, but there was like an overwhelming sense of just don't talk about it. Like that's not real. All of that was maybe, I suppose, ended in the apostolic age or before. So,
which I feel like that's become almost a type of thought process that's spread over the population. I think most people, in general, the science community, most church communities, there's very few people that actually are the exact opposite of that, which is why I think a lot of people are tuning into shows like ours, because times are changing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, people who are, upstanding, functioning members of society have these experiences, and they can't all be crazy. So, yeah. I have a lot of stories, but I don't know how many of them weave into the overarching narrative. I do remember they came to me one night. So my uncle had horses. We always had horses. And my uncle had 2 mares he was going to have bred to a stallion. And then he came to me and he said, I'm going to let you have whichever of the foals you want. It'll be your horse forever. And I was thrilled. I was, 12 or 13. And I remember going to sleep one night, and these entities came to me and they said, tell us what you want your horse to look like. And I know how it sounds. It sounds insane. It sounds like, it sounds insane, but I got to custom design my own pony. And when the foals were born, of the 2 foals, that horse was standing there. And it was sort of, it was one of those things where, again, I was sort of not consciously thinking about it in the moment, but then later, I wrote in my diary religiously growing up. So if it weren't for my diaries, I wouldn't have a record of any of this. And, I had these entities would come to me in my dreams. They would show me events from the future. They would show me things from my future, events in my family's future in general. And I just sort of tucked it away. But at the same time, in the back of my mind, I was always wondering, what are they doing and why are they showing me this stuff? And they can't be evil. An evil entity wouldn't come to you and ask you what what do you want your pony to look like? That's a gift, right? And it's the kind of gift that might get you thrown into the bottom of a well if you tell it too many times. But so I didn't. But
Joe, but there's like with this story, you talk about very specific things with the horse that you asked for.
Yes.
And that happened, right?
Yeah. Everything down. He was, even his personality, like this horse. I never had to break him. It's like he was born broke. He was a dog, like in his personality, he had the personality of a Labrador. And he was also kind of weird because he was the only horse I ever knew who would stand outside and watch planes flying in the night sky or track. Like he would stand outside and just watch stars or, things in the sky, satellites. He was a weird horse and he was great. But
wow. I want to say, this reminds me of so Trent, we interviewed Trent who said the same thing. He said these gray aliens would show up and they would kind of give him visions of the future. And at first I hadn't really heard that before. But it's difficult, right? It's like, where do you place this? And you can't immediately, we've seen in our channels this last 2 weeks that everything that you hear is all a psyop deception. And it's a very limited, narrow view of everything. It's kind of a knee-jerk fear reaction of like, this doesn't, I never thought about this or heard about this, so it has to be bad. It has to come from a place of a reactionary response to what's happening. But I think Luke and I have heard so many random things out of the box the last couple of years that we can kind of, I don't know what to make of that. But I'm not saying one way or the other. I'm just listening, and it seems like it's in line with what other people have said. So just to give you some context there.
Yeah, I definitely, looking back, I see how it eroded my faith, because it was like I had a secret second family that they weren't coming from the Christian perspective. They were giving me nice little things on the side and showing me things. I have to preface all of this by saying I did not know anything about aliens except, perhaps what I saw in pop culture. So I had no area in my brain for grays, for, the Hat Man, any of this stuff. Most of this stuff's taking place before the internet was ever even really a thing.
So do you look at it kind of like now, like the White Witch in Narnia gives the Turkish Delight like a little present?
I really do. I think it was currying favor. I think it was, I hate to use the word grooming, but it was a lot of it was sowing the seeds of causing me to realize wrongly, but to realize that there was another way that made more sense and that accounted for the supernatural that was occurring in my life.
I've always wondered this. I've wondered if there are certain people who have gifts and these entities show up at a young age and try, call it clairvoyant, call whatever you want. They have a gift and they show up and try to deceive them and recruit them, kind of thing. Come over to our side. Because they're looking at specific bloodlines. They're interested in certain types of people. And you wonder if they know you have these spiritual gifts, so we're going to hijack them at a young age. We're going to get you over to our side. Because it sounds like some people, they can walk into the field of dreams and others can't, and it doesn't make any sense. And so a lot of people who can't, they get really upset, or they change this. They say it's impossible. These people are all deceived. And I just don't think that's I don't think that answer includes all the data, but keep going.
No, you're good. You're making a really good point. Yeah. In fact, I am kind of cringing having told you about the horse because it's so crazy. But
no, it's not though.
I had another experience that I'm going to go ahead and tell you, and I'm going to leave it to you to decide if this is relevant. But this happened when I was about 16. I was working in a boutique, and there was a real battle for my soul going on. My entire childhood, I've always believed in God. Like I told you, I've never had the privilege of being an agnostic. I've always known that Jesus Christ is real and that, he is real. And yet, I also knew this other stuff was real. And from what I could tell, the Christian faith wasn't able to account for it. So the whole time I'm growing up, I have this sort of tension. And one day I was about 16, I'm working in this boutique, and it was a rainy, dark day. And this bizarre person that I had never seen before came walking into the boutique, and he was dressed from head to toe. Like he had walked into a Hot Topic and they said, "What would you like?" And he said, "Yes."
Yeah.
He had
that's a great description.
He was wearing the tight tartan pants. He had the big black chunky boots. He was the freakiest guy. And I grew up in the Midwest, so he would have been invisible in LA, but where I was from, he stood out like a sore thumb. And he came into the toy store. I'd never seen him before, and I've never seen him since. He was tall. He was blonde. He had long, stringy blonde hair. He was incredibly pale, and he had pale, almost iridescent, almost translucently pale blue eyes. And he comes into this boutique. He immediately locks eyes with me. And my first thought is, oh, great. It's just, he's a creep, So I was standing at the register, and it was one of those really old fashioned registers where you had to, before when you had to count back change. And he's walking around this little boutique, but I'm thinking there's no reason for this man to be in here. There's nothing in here for him. This was a little kitsch shop for, 40-year-old women and above. So and some kid stuff in there as well, obviously, but he walks around, but he won't stop looking at me. So I start grabbing, we had a price tag gun under the counter. And I'm thinking, okay, if he comes over here and he tries to do something, I'm going to have to get him I'm going to have to tag him with his price tag gun. But he comes over, and he's going to buy this. I don't even remember what it was. It was maybe a sticker or something. And he looks at me as I'm ringing him up, and he says to my face, "Joe," except he says my full name. He says, "I have been wanting to meet you for quite some time. It is so good to finally meet." And he knew my name. And the way he was looking at me, it was the most predatory, creepy grin. And I remember looking into his eyes, and there was something not quite right about his pupils. I couldn't tell you what it was, but like I said, his eyes were just so pale blue, and there was something almost sickly about him. I don't know how to describe it, but he handed me his money, and as I was counting back his change, I had to give him some coins. He grabbed my hand so that we made contact. I wanted to just drop the change into his hand, but he made a point to grab my hand. And the moment he did, a powerful electric surge went through my body from my feet up through my head. And I blacked out. I didn't fall, but I was frozen. I was sort of like, it was like I was being electrified. And I don't know how long that lasted, but when I came back to, I was standing in front of the register, and then he was leaving.
Wow.
And I have never had a category in my brain for what the hell was that. I never did see him again. And then it wasn't until after I started listening to your podcast, and then I started, doing some of my own reading. I thought much later, decades later, I thought, is it possible that was a Nordic? I don't know. I don't know what he was doing, or if he was just, a Satanist, or if he was just a creep. I can tell you that the electrical surge that he sent through my body wasn't one of those little prank buzzers, because we did carry those in the store. So, and I have brothers.
Oh my
I have plenty of brothers, so I know what it's like to get pranked with a buzzer, an electrical current. This was something that caused my whole body to just sort of, I was paralyzed, and I lost my vision. I lost my hearing. So I have no answers as to what happened there.
Well, that kind of goes in line with what I just said a little bit ago. It's like they kind of falls in line with they knew at a young age, whoever it is.
Yeah.
I'm not saying this is the case, but it seems as though this guy shows up on the scene. He looks like he's not from here, and he says, "I've been waiting to meet you."
Yeah.
It's like they get a list, and they know who to mess with.
And I was so shaken by that event. I remember that after I gathered myself, I immediately closed the boutique down. I called my boss and I told her, listen, I cannot stay here. I have to go home. And she understood. She didn't ask too many questions. I think she could hear in my voice that it was something big, but I did close the store down because it rattled me, and it stuck with me. And I dreaded going into work for weeks after that, because I thought, if he comes back, what am I going to do? And of course I did share the story with some people, and they were all just like, oh, that's crazy. Anyway, what do you want for dinner?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny because I got food poisoning yesterday and sat on the couch and just watched movies all day, and I watched Men in Black. And I hadn't watched it in 15 years or so. And part of me was thinking, I wonder if the world is more like this than we even realize. We're all kind of walking around just, I don't know if you've seen the movie, but they walk among us. They're among us. We hear this on our show all the time. They're interbreeding with society. They're here already. We've heard it early on in the show that people say that. And you have this experience at a young age, and you know this. And it's got to be very hard for you not to go, okay, how does the biblical paradigm explain this? Because you feel like the biblical paradigm it's just not where you are when you're experiencing all this. It's like way behind. You need it to catch up to you. And there's not a lot of people explaining it in a way that can help it catch up to you. So
especially in the late 90s and the early 2000s, we didn't have the internet to the extent we have now, where you could find people that had similar experiences. And just, I guess,
or even podcasts really helped me grow my faith, listening to guys like David Paulides, who basically laid it out in very scientific terms that people are walking from our world to somewhere else. And, it takes a long time for your brain to wrap your mind around the data. It's not an animal. It's not a bear. It's not Sasquatch. It's they're here and then they're gone. What do you do with that as a Christian if you don't have, it takes years for your mind to go, okay, something's taking people. But yeah, that's a really hard time. Late 90s, all we had was Bob Lazar's story, really.
Well, I would say what I think is interesting too is that you have these entities show up as a kid. You have this hooded entity. And Nate, what made me think of kind of right away was what Tony Merkel from the Confessionals talked about, where this hooded entity would come and try to recruit kids. and come work for me, right? And he's got some really fascinating, wild stories about something like that happening. And you have these entities show up and they're showing you the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And these future events then happen.
Yes. And that was actually one of those specifically is the reason I ended up making the decision to walk away from my faith and to sort of throw myself headlong into, what I thought at the time were better answers. And it's hard for me to delineate, when it's lucid dreaming, sleep paralysis, and then being thrown into the astral. I do have a rough framework. I think that Vicki Joy Anderson has a pretty good explanation. She talks about how when you're in the astral, you have your own inner monologue, and it's you, you're thinking like, well, this is, it's you. And I'm a naturally snarky person, especially around these entities, because I know how malicious they can be and how deceptive they are. So when I'm in that environment with them, I don't give them the time of day. And the ones that are malicious, they can't stand that, and they show their true colors pretty quickly.
So are you this is like testing the spirits, right? We're told to test the spirits. Are you doing this at a young age? Is this what you think that means?
Yeah, I have to clarify. This is in the context of me describing me then. So I don't play around with this stuff. But, I feel like I didn't really have an area in my brain even at that time to understand what was going on, or even to know enough to test the spirits, because at that point they were still very benevolent. There was one scary incident that happened, but it wasn't even scary because let me just tell you the story, I guess. So one time I recall waking up in the astral, and by that, I simply mean it felt like I was floating in deep space, and I was in total, I wasn't in control, but I was in control of me. And suddenly there was this brilliant light, and it was shining down on me like a spotlight. And I'm going to be very fumbling, and words are not going to be able to properly describe this light that was shining on me. It could see through me. It was like it was seeing every single part of me, even the parts of me that I thought that no one could ever see, both past, present, and future. And standing beside it was this sort of brilliant person. And I recall the brilliant spotlight shining down on me. And it was even the parts of me that I consciously would say, well, this is a good quality that I have. I'm selfless. It could see into my selflessness, and it was showing me that even in my selflessness, there was a sin nature. There was a selfishness within that. It could see into all of my best and most noble deeds and actions, again, past, present, and future. And it was like, even within each of my purest motives, there was that grain of pride or, some sort of sin that had found its way in. And it was basically like I was completely undone, like down to my DNA. There was no part of me that was going to be able to withstand this scrutiny. And I remember being so ashamed and just so overwhelmed with just, intense emotion. And this voice came from the light, and it said, "Obey me." And I responded very weakly, "I'm trying." And I felt the sort of person that was standing to the side looking on me, and he could also see every part of me. He was seeing the same thing that the light could see, but he understood. I wouldn't say that he understood. It wasn't a particularly, it wasn't overwhelmed with the sensation of love or anything like that. But I got the distinct impression that they were showing me that even in my obedience, I needed to obey. And it took me a long time to unpack that. It took me decades. In fact, I'm still unpacking it, because on the one hand, I feel like that was a very divine warning to obey. But on the other hand, I used to be very angry, because if that was God, I remember thinking, like, what kind of thing is that to say to a 17-year-old, right? But the point of the experience and the effect that it had, I think, is the point. And the effect that it did have was it showed me that even in my obedience, there were grains of disobedience. And it was almost like a loving warning that I needed to check myself before I wrecked myself. Because what followed was I had an experience where an entity came to me and they asked me, what do you want to see? And I said, show me the person that I'm going to fall in love with. And so I was transported with this entity, and we were standing in an apartment. I saw a young man. I saw him clear as day. We were sort of floating in the room behind him, and he was engaged in a very highly specific activity with a very highly specific tool where it's, you may meet one person in your lifetime who is proficient at this thing. And so it was such an exact, let me rephrase this. It was such a clear picture. It was like I was standing in the room directly behind him. I saw him. I saw his apartment. I saw the things in his apartment. And I also knew as soon as I saw him that he was ill. And I remember asking the entity standing next to me, what's wrong with him? What is he sick with? And the entity's only response was, he doesn't know. So fast forward years later, I meet this person. And, I didn't know right away that this was the person that I had seen years before. But it became apparent after, a few months, because I saw exactly what I had seen in the apartment. And he looked exactly like that person. And so it was that vision specifically that gave me I don't know what the word is here, not inspiration, but it gave me the courage to walk away from my faith, walk away from my family, walk away from everything. Because in my mind and in my heart, I was following my destiny, because the entity told me, this is your person. Yeah. And so when I had to make a choice between my faith and my family and this person who I was shown years before, I chose to take that road to follow my quote unquote destiny. And so that I was about, maybe 25 when that happened. And that's kind of when it all started.
Did you end up with this person?
We were together for about 6 years. However, one thing that's important, and this will become apparent as I speak, things that often come to you in terms of destiny or fate, at least in my experience, the poison is in the cup, if that makes sense. Yeah.
That's what I wanted to ask. You have these sort of experiences. I imagine it can be intoxicating because you have this knowledge, right? It's given, and like you said, the poison's in the cup, right? So it's to me, it's like hearing people using Ouija boards and asking, who am I going to marry, right? And they end up marrying this person, and it's destructive, right? It's that kind of. It's just interesting to see you sitting on the other side to see what would happen. But I don't want to derail the story, because I know that this pushes this is the impetus, right? This pushes you completely out the door,
right,
of the church and into a new paradigm, a new space, right? New age, actually.
Exactly. And I guess I do need to back up, because one thing that I think is interesting, you guys talk a lot about, why people have these experiences, and especially with sleep paralysis. Vicky Joy, in the episode that you had with her, the interview that you had with her, she talked about, bloodlines, and, there are agreements that are made in that realm, which give these things access. One thing that I think is of interest is, I don't know if you guys are familiar with NDEs or OBEs, that's near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences. Mm-hmm. So there is some research out there, and I don't recommend this researcher's worldview or many of her conclusions, but it's PMH Atwater. She's done a lot of research with NDEs, and she's found that people who experience near-death experiences, or even out-of-body experiences to a lesser extent, those can be people who have those experiences will often have a sudden onset of psychic experiences after they recover. Supernatural activity will kick up. They'll start to have an effect on electricity or electric objects around them. And this is based on 40 years of her research. And I had an NDE when I was 2 months old. So it could have started then, but I had a surgery in 2010. And after the surgery, I flatlined and I had an out-of-body experience wherein I was out of my body while they were trying to bring me back. And immediately following this out-of-body post-op experience, I started to be visited by sleep paralysis demons. That was the onset of my sleep paralysis. And so I would be curious to know if more people have had experiences like that, where it's not so much that they participated in a psychic or a Ouija board event, but maybe it was more so that their body and their soul were separated, or there was sort of a separation that happened within them. It could even be medically induced. But that was started about 7 years of sleep paralysis attacks. And so, it was just constant.
Joe, can you talk about what that was like? Like, you're out of your body. I mean, it's out of body experience. But are you in, like, up in the ceiling watching?
Yeah, so I
try to revive you?
Yes, I exited my body fully. I was not afraid. In fact, I remember looking down on my body and the medical professionals around me and thinking, that's interesting. Kind of weird, but okay. And I floated over and I started, eavesdropping on other conversations that were going on. I even went up to the front desk and I overheard the front desk nurse, who was sort of overseeing the whole recovery area. She got on the phone with my surgeon and was telling her, like, we need to get this, kid to a room right now. I was aware of the hubbub. And it didn't bother me, and I didn't see any entities. I didn't see Jesus. I didn't see Buddha. I didn't see any of that. I was just in the hospital room floating around. And then I got, at some point I went back into my body and woke up, and it was much less peaceful being back in my body because I was hooked up to IVs.
Was it a jarring experience to kind of go back in? Like, I've heard that just in listening to some anecdotal stories about that, is kind of getting slammed back into your flesh.
I don't recall being slammed back in. I do recall thinking, wow, there's a lot more pain now. There was no pain before. I would like to not be in this body.
Well, This kind of reminds me of an experience I had. I remember when I was a freshman playing football, first time really playing the game, had a pretty wild concussion. And I remember sitting on the bench. I couldn't remember anything. And all of a sudden I was floating out of my body. The same thing. I remember like watching myself on the bench. It was the weirdest experience of my life. But I thought, there's no way I floated out of my body. I thought I just had a concussion. I just wasn't there. But now that you're describing this and what I've heard from other people, I wondered if that's what happened to me in that moment, because it was so weird. I could remember every dream I've ever had. And it was like I was accessing this whole other part of my mind. And I couldn't remember a play. I couldn't play the game anymore. I couldn't even, it was just the strangest experience. And I wonder if something like this happens to you and there's these dreams involved and there's sleep paralysis now, it's like, was some sort of barrier broken? Right.
Yeah. And that's kind of a theory that I've heard, and it's based on, like I said, lots of research, and I won't mention her name again just because I don't want to promote her.
Yeah, no, totally. I get it.
But she does have 40 years of research with thousands of NDE and OBE experiencers. So some of her research is probably...
It's just compiling data, right? So like whether or not her worldview is the same. It reminds me of sort of the ufologist.
Right.
Same idea, right? Like you might not agree with their conclusions, but the fact they're compiling, years and 30, 40 years of anecdotal data is sort of neither here nor there. It is what it is. It's funny when your description reminds me of one of my favorite movies, Tombstone, when Doc Holliday, who's sidebar, is probably the greatest written character in any film ever. It's just my opinion, but he's dying and he's saying, "Oh, that's fun." He's wiggling his toes like it's like this. You sense it as this is sort of this funny feeling to be loose of your body. That's fascinating. So this happened. I mean, you've had an unbelievable sort of childhood in this sense, right? You're or even into young adulthood. You have entities that visit. You have they're showing you the future. Kind of my thought when I think about that is like the ghost of Christmas future in the Christmas Carol, where you get to go and stand in the room and see things, but you're not interacting, right? You just get to see like, oh yeah, this is what happens if XYZ happens. That's amazing. And then then you have this OBE, sleep paralysis comes on. And what happens from there? Like so I mean, obviously, as we talked about from the top of the show, is that you grew up in the church, and there was whether they're cessationists or not really important, because I think in most cases the supernatural is really underplayed. Just this is broad brush. This isn't every church. There are a multitude of wonderful churches that address this and recognize the very supernatural aspect of our faith and everything that happened in the scripture, in the text. It was very much supernatural, right? But broad brush, we live in an academic paradigm, and so it's much easier to say that's just happened then. If we're going to still believe, and this is just me paraphrasing, that just happened back then, once the apostles, passed away or martyred and are gone, those gifts are gone, right? And it's an easy way to sort of say, everything can be measured now. There's nothing miraculous and nothing weird or paranormal, if you want to use the vernacular of the secular world, right? That doesn't exist, and yet here you are experiencing all these things, and that causes you to veer into a very different place.
Right. Yeah. So, I dealt with the sleep paralysis. I dealt with that for years before I met my partner. And then, of course, I told you I met him. And when I recognized him from the vision, that's when I made that decision. I'm walking away. I'm going to follow my destiny. And I'm also going to find answers that will actually satisfy the questions that I have. And so I didn't immediately go to the occult. Of course, I started with Jung, as one does, trying to, the archetypal route, and trying to find a way to rationalize it. And then I thought, no, I need something that will actually account for the actual, personalities that I'm dealing with. And especially these sleep paralysis personalities, they are distinct. Mine was feminine, and she followed me for years. And following that post-op OBE, she was with me constantly. And
can you describe that? Like, she would show up during bouts of sleep paralysis?
So let me just give you my first experience with her. It was shortly after surgery. So I was in bed, I was recovering, and I was laying on one side. And sometimes with my sleep paralysis, I am locked into my body, and I am accurately hearing and perceiving the things that are actually going on in the house. There have been times when I've had sleep paralysis, and then in the middle of it, I will hear somebody walk into the house, and you hear them unloading the groceries into the kitchen and putting things away in the fridge. And so after it's over, after I escape, I get up and I go out and I say, were you just did you just do this? Yes. Were you just on the phone with so-and-so? Oh yeah, they called. And so sometimes in sleep paralysis, there is that, what does Vicky Joy call it? The sort of screen or the overlay. There can be that, but my first experience with sleep paralysis, I was hyper aware of what was happening in the house. I was locked into my body, and the bed dips down behind me, and I feel this hand rest on my back. And I thought at first it was my mother, because I knew that it was feminine. And then all of a sudden it goes from sort of just touching my back to taking one finger and just jabbing it into my back. And she bends over me and she starts whispering, "It's time to go to sleep." And I remember the way she was jabbing me, it was so painful. And I don't remember if I called out to Jesus at that point or not. I just remember I had never had that experience before in my life. I had no idea what was going on. And the whole time I could hear my mom and my brothers in the other room. And when I finally escaped and was able to, take control of my body again, I called to them, and then I was able to accurately describe to them everything that they had been doing in the house while I was going through that, down to phone calls and everything that I was hearing. So that was my first experience with her. A lot of what ended up unfolding with her was, it became like very vampiric in nature. One time, many years later, she crawled into bed behind me, and I had been sleeping. And so when she crawled into bed behind me, my first conscious thought was, oh, this must be, you know, my boyfriend. Yeah. But then as it started, like, she, you know, at this point I'm thinking it's him. As it's moving closer and the bed's moving with its weight, I start to realize, no, he's not here. You know, he's not anywhere near here. This isn't him. And so in my head, I remember addressing her and saying, you're not him. And she was right up behind me at this point. And she whispered into my ear, yes, I'm not him, but wouldn't it be a lovely dream to have? But wouldn't it be a lovely dream to have? But wouldn't it be a lovely dream to have? And that was the tenor, that was the nature of what she would try to do. She would either come immediately to torment me, or she would try to insert herself into dreams that would quickly turn into lucid dreams, or she would come in the sleep paralysis state. She came into my room quite a few different ways, quite a few different times, but always the nature of the visit was the same. It was an attempt at seduction, if not just outright torment. But she couldn't do anything without my permission. And as soon as I became aware that it was her, I would immediately, you know, call out to Jesus, or I would not give permission. And then at the point when she realized that she wasn't going to get her way, she would immediately just become nasty. She was it was a malicious energy. And when I say she, I don't assume that it was a she, but that's just how it always presented itself to me. So yeah, it was very much what people describe as, you know, that succubus or incubus energy, always seeking to seduce you with a dream. And if you will allow yourself to go along with it, they may not show you what they really are, or they might. And then that just adds to their pleasure, because, you know, you grant permission to this thing to proceed. And then it's, you know, has the joy of revealing itself to you. And now you're stuck because you gave it permission to come in and to be in that space with you. So yeah, I never granted her permission, but she didn't stop trying for about 6 years. She was with me.
So you're still calling on Jesus at this point.
Oh yeah, like I said, I knew he was real. I know. I mean, it's really hard to describe, because there was a part of me that was incredibly angry at God and incredibly just finished with the Christian faith. But on the other hand, there's certain jobs that only Jesus can do. So, you know, as messed up as that was, at the time, I figured out organically on my own that calling on Jesus was the only thing that would repel these attacks, until I discovered the occult. Because once I made contact with my quote unquote guides, the sleep paralysis stopped completely. I mean,
I was gonna ask you, Joe. I was gonna ask you if that kicked up as you delved into the occult.
No. Well, okay. Let me give you.
So how does talk to us about how? Well, also talk to us about how you dove into that. You know, I know we've kind of danced around it, because you're walking away from your faith. You're having all these experiences. Church is not giving you answers. Right. So you're angry with God, but you go full on. You know, because I know a bit of the story. So I'm playing with a stacked deck here, but I finished your thought when the parenthetical there, and then talked about how you got into this, because you go full on. This isn't just like, man, I'm going on these yoga retreats, to Sedona, and I'm going to stand on the vortexes and all that stuff. That you went full on and joined the team.
Yeah, I wanted to make contact. I was tired of them skirting around and not showing themselves, and then just being like somewhat useful some of the time. And I wanted to know who they were. But the parentheses is that when I say the sleep paralysis stopped, I have in my notes that I went 5 years without any sleep paralysis experiences. And I did the math.
Wow.
So when I say I didn't have that, I don't really believe that I didn't experience it. I think that they were just wiping my memory, or I just didn't recall it. I don't believe for a second that involving myself in the occult drove the darkness away. But it did, or maybe perhaps my guides or so-called guides, they were higher up on the totem pole, and these lower entities were just, the sleep paralysis demons were driven away because I don't know. But to my mind, when it started with tarot. I was trying to find ways to develop my psychic gifts, and a tarot reader is kind of like a psychic, but with more steps, because you're using cards to interpret what's being given to you. If you talk to tarot readers, all have very unique theories and styles and philosophies, and I don't want to bring any glory to that. I can only speak to my own experience, but I started studying the occult. I was studying tarot from people who were highly achieving, Wall Street level execs, and they also practiced tarot, and they had a successful tarot, teaching series or a seminar or a class that, you could take. And I started studying under these very highly reputable people, because I thought, well, if they're making it work and they're, very high achieving in the world, they're, fabulously successful, they're not witches, they're just people that are able to divine messages using these various means. I thought, well, it can't be bad. There's this idea that tarot readers are, these witches, and they're huddled in these little huts and they're looking at their cards under candlelight. No, these are lawyers. These are people who work on Wall Street, high level people who read tarot.
Well, they're doing divination.
Yes,
this is divination.
It's divination, right? Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. And so these were the people that I went to learn, because I thought, well, I'm not going to learn from witches. I'm going to learn from people who are better than that. And that was my logic. Turns out that they all were witches. I didn't find that out till many years later. So when I say I dove into the occult and I studied everything that I possibly could, as deeply as I could, I mean it. I mean, the tarot cards for me were just, this is a bit of a crude analogy, but a bit more like a Rorschach for the spirits who are with me to use to communicate. And sometimes they didn't need the tarot cards. I would receive the download directly, but the tarot cards were there as a sort of to serve as a confirmation for whatever possible language barrier there may be. And so I started practicing that. And as far as divination goes, I was, good at it, to my everlasting shame. But it was a path that I took because it gave me it gave me a sense of control. I guess that's kind of the point. I felt like I was so out of control for so much of my life. And these things would just happen to me, or I'd have a dream, or the sleep paralysis demons would attack me, and I didn't have any answers, and I certainly had no control. And so by delving into, meditation, different forms of occult ritual, all of the usual things, I was taking back control so that I could have communication with these things on my terms, and also to form alliances with entities that could protect me from the lower level ones that were following me around, tormenting me. And it worked for 5 years. While I was in the occult, I don't remember ever having a sleep paralysis attack. So in that regard, I felt like I was doing really well for myself, and I'd solved my problem. I felt like the church this is my perspective. Then I felt like the church had become this sort of outdated and decrepit tool that no longer worked to solve my problems. And I had found a way to have community and to talk to these entities who were protecting me and who were there for me. And, so there was the very last sleep paralysis episode I had was right around the time I made contact with my guides.
Real quick, I mean, this is a common term, so I don't want to judge. Just
right.
for clarification, because I know we talked about tarot, and like people have some familiarity, right? Like it feels like fortune telling. You most cities you walk around, you find like a little rented house that's like a psychic tarot card, right? And I think most people kind of think that's just like fortune telling mumbo jumbo. And what you're saying is no. What happens is these entities tell you and they communicate with you through these cards. This is like, high level, this is like next step up Ouija board kind of thing.
Exactly.
And then when you talk about spirit guides, that's a very new age term, right? This is, if you have any encounters and you're listening to this with the new age, there's this idea that there's this spirit that goes with you and you communicate with it and it quote guides you. Of course, as your story and testimony played out, that they don't guide you to anything that isn't anything but destructive or evil, even though it's given to you as a destiny. I like how you said that, because I think that's always how things are wrapped, right? These things are benevolent, and this is your destiny, and I think it's important because this is part and parcel for you because you lived through this. But just so people understand, like these are common things you'll hear if you listen, but this is not like hippie talk or this is not fun. Like I remember when my youngest brother was graduating from high school, my mom went to war with the parent board and the administration at church at the high school because they thought it'd be really fun to have a fortune teller come to their senior party. And it's just fun and games, right? And I want people to listen to this. This is not, you're talking about high level people doing divination in order to figure out what their moves are on Wall Street, for example, which I think is as a fascinating paradigm, because then if you needed to believe there's something to it, then Joe's story, in addition to what we're talking about, this is prevalent. These people are witches, and what they're doing is talking and communicating with real entities. And you're stressing this, but I want to just re-stress it because I think this is a powerful story in that sense, because I think sometimes we as a people, and I'm not saying we generally speaking, we as humanity will just sort of haphazardly, just sort of brush things off like tarot as it being like, oh, it's just, it's a card game. It's just fun. It's just fun to like pretend, it's like the little paper things we made in junior high where you pick the numbers and pick the things and it would tell you like what kind of car, or MASH. Remember MASH, Nate? Where it'd be like, like, would you live in a mansion, an apartment, a shack, or a house? Right? It's just like fun, goofy, and you put your crushes in the underneath as options, and you play these games, right? But that's not what this is. Like this is. This is not that. So I'll let you continue, but I just think it's important to call this out because when we talk about a spirit guide, you actually had an entity that was with you.
I had.
Maybe you would say assigned to you.
Yeah, and more than one. Yeah, I don't know that they were necessarily assigned to me, but I guess also to your point, first of all, just as a little aside to your anecdote about your brother, when my mom was in school, this would have been in the 80s, the early 80s, they brought in a Ouija board when she was a little kid, and they were going to have all the kids practice with the Ouija board. And my mother, out of her entire class, was the only child who stood up and said, I will not do this. And so how far have I fallen from my mother's standard? I'm neck deep in the occult, and my mom wouldn't even play with a Ouija board when she was a kid. But yeah, no, these are not happy-go-lucky angels. These are not spirit guides. When I use these phrases, I guess I'm using words that are in the vernacular, right? Yeah. But no, they're definitely they are demonic, and my fascination, quote unquote, with them would have never occurred had I not experienced them. And so there's almost a seduction there where I don't have the privilege of not believing in them. They have done nice things for me. And yet now I'm having these demonic attacks. So of course I want to be allied with the ones that are more powerful, that I perceive as benevolent, so that they can protect me.
Right. And what I think is interesting, Joe, is that like as you're talking about this and I think about it, it is the promise of the darkness, right? Like it's the idea. We were just talking with Dr. Laura Sanger recently about music, and there's this idea of like there's the whole famous story about selling your soul to the devil, right? It's Robert Johnson at the crossroads, right? And you get these gifts, and it's the same temptation of Christ. I'll give you the cities. It's the idea to make you famous and give you things. And what you find out at the end of this is that what seems to be benevolent and they're giving you these gifts, those are ultimately the ruiners of your life, and they're ultimately all destructive. Whether it be fame, whether it be riches, etc. Those things are not inherently bad. But what they do, though, is those ultimately corrupt. If you are, and I've said this a ton of times, it is so unbelievably difficult when you're given those type of things, which is what Satan tempts Christ with: the cities of the earth, adoration, worship, and as people, right? When you get this, it is ultimately destructive, although it comes as something that feels benevolent, right? It's this gift, but it's I think
there's a time of plenty. I think that some of these, I think that it wouldn't be such a thing in ancient history and in modern times if people didn't get something from it for a short period of time.
Yes, exactly. There's a trade, right? Like and are you, just back to your story then, you come from the church, you probably, are you acutely aware at this time too that like even though you're in these spaces and you're having sort of this satisfaction, maybe what feels like answers to some of the things you've had, like still being like, do you have a nagging sense of like, this stuff is still really bad even though I'm here?
Yeah, it's funny you should ask that. So Jesus served as a problem. he was really blocking my ascension, man. So yeah, I had a card, and it's called a jumper card, and it's a card that will present itself. I won't go into a lot of detail on it because, again, I don't want to bring glory to it, but it's something that will physically jump out of the deck. And I was really good at shuffling, so it's not the work of me just being a crappy shuffler and the cards fly. Right. Now there was one specific card that would jump out of the deck when there was a specific entity or guide, as I called him, present, and it was the 3 of Wands. And so when I saw that, I would be like, okay, there's something here, and whatever happens next is going to be from him. But to back up, I'm so sorry to back up for just briefly.
Oh, you're good. No.
Right when I started dabbling in the occult, that's when I had my experience with the hooded entity. It was right around the time I was opening myself up, and this was I think my last sleep paralysis episode that been probably before I had my hiatus from them. So I'm laying on my bed. I had just opened myself up. I'd done like a meditation, and then it was bedtime, so I was laying on my bed. I went to sleep. I awaken in my bed. I'm locked into my body, and I open my eyes, or what I think is opening my eyes, and standing over my bed there is this tall hooded entity. And beside him are standing 3 little people. They have really big bulbous heads. They look like your classic gray. Now, I want to stress, this is years before I ever found blurry creatures. This is years before I ever knew that grays were little. Huh. I mean, my only alien reference at that point was probably whatever I'd seen on TV. We didn't have a lot of movies or TV growing up. So I had no area in my brain for grays and no context. Yeah. And they were standing beside my bed, and it was the weirdest thing because from the tall hooded entity, I felt a malevolent, almost a hatred, and it was directed at me. From the grays, I felt absolutely nothing. They were almost, I wouldn't say benevolent, but they were so incredibly neutral that in my panicked sleep paralysis state, I remember thinking, at least they're not against me. And then up above in the ceiling over my head, there was this swirling black vortex up in the corner of the ceiling. It looked like a wormhole. And I remember, at the time, I remember calling on Jesus and thinking, okay, great. Like that worked because they were gone. And I thought, wow, that was a close one. I have no idea where they were planning on taking me. But since finding blurry creatures and learning, through your interview with Tim Alberino, I don't know if what I was actually conscious of was the beginning or the end of the experience. So that was my last experience, because at that point I thought, okay, this cannot continue. I've got to figure out how to protect myself.
So when you talk about the jumper card, because you went forward and back here, is that was what would show up, the hooded guy and the three grays?
And it was kind of a plot twist, because that was not revealed to me until years later, after I had repented. So I had multiple astral experiences where I would be attended by three somethings. And they were always like little. There was one time I awoke and I was walking through this snowy landscape. I remember there was almost like an aurora borealis going on in the sky. We were walking through the snow. It was me. I was in my pajamas. I was barefoot, and yet my feet were not cold in the snow. And I was being guided by three white wolves. And it's me, I'm lucid. I'm looking around and I'm seeing these three white wolves who are with me. And I'm thinking, well, this is weird. What am I doing here? And then the next thing I remember, I black out. And the next thing I remember is being on my bed, or in a place where I'm on something like my bed. And there were all these hands grabbing me, and they were grabbing me to hold me down. And the three white wolves were also there, but they didn't intervene and they didn't help. And I remember thinking, why are they so impassive? Like, what, they're here to guard me. Like, why are they not helping? And I eventually gathered I stopped panicking long enough to call on the name of Jesus. I wake up, it's the next morning, I'm in my bed. It was like 4:45 when I woke up, and that was when my alarm would go off for me to get up anyway. So I get up, and I actually ended up calling one of my friends, and my friend actually did identify as a witch. And I remember going over the experience with her and thinking and describing to her, I was there, whether it was astral or not, I was there, and I was attended by these three white wolves. They were there to protect me. I didn't get any negative energy from them. But then when all of those hands were pulling me down onto the bed and they were grabbing me, they didn't intervene. And she thought about it, and she eventually told me, well, I think that those were your spirit guides, and they didn't intervene because they knew that you needed to find the strength within yourself to save yourself. And at first I thought, well, I guess that kind of makes sense. Spirit guides are there to help you, stretch your muscles and to get stronger. And, maybe they didn't intervene because they were hoping I would find it within myself. But the thing is, the more I thought about it, the less sense it made, because I didn't have the strength to save myself. I had to call on Jesus. I didn't have it within myself to make the experience stop. I had to call on Jesus and cry out to him. And so it just didn't make sense. So anyway, another time I was sitting in the living room, and I was with a kid I know. And at the time she was 4 years old. And this was around the time that I'd had the dream with the three white wolves. And we're sitting in such a way that my back was to a hallway, and there were two rooms on either side of the hallway. And the little girl was facing me on the other side of the table. And we were drawing together. And that sensation, like when one of your family members walks behind you, and you can tell because the air moves, the hair on the back of your neck kind of moves. You can tell who they are by their footfall. You just know. You don't have to look to know. Well, I'm sitting facing this little girl. She's facing me on the other side of the table. I sense three, what I thought were children, pass out of one of the bedrooms, walk directly behind me, go down the hall, and go into the other room. At the exact same time I'm experiencing this, the little girl looks up from her drawing, looks over my shoulder, tracks these things with her eyes, and then once they disappear into the other room, she looks up at me, she cracks a little grin, and she says, they just walked behind you. And had I experienced,
it sounds like a horror movie. This is like full on like a horror movie.
Yeah, and had I experienced that on my own, I would have explained it away. I would have, I made that up, or I was being, I was in, whatever. But the little girl saw them, and I remember asking her, well, who was it? And she's like, they were, just kids. And I didn't press the issue because I'm not, I didn't want to get into it right then. I was like, we're going downstairs, man. Grab your crayons. Here we go. But a few weeks later, I asked her, would you describe to me what they look like? And she told me, no, because I don't want to. And I said, well, why not? And she said, because it's just too scary. And I thought, okay. Jeez. So, it took years of all of these experiences coming together. And then that with the jumper card, it wasn't until after I had repented, I was reflecting, and I realized that those three, the three that would always show up, I wonder if those were not the three little grays. The card itself, the Three of Wands, it's a tall person. He's cloaked. His back is to you. You don't ever see his face. And he's got these three staves with him. Staves are, as you know, walking sticks. And the three staves on this card, they are blooming with leaves and buds. So they are not alive, and yet they are alive. They are tools. He's a journeyer. He takes them with him. Walking sticks, tools, they're used for protection. They're used for, it was just like the similarities between what I had seen standing by my bed and what I experienced in other episodes. It became clear to me, like, I'm not sure if what I was experiencing was so much a spirit guide. Maybe it was more so an extraterrestrial thing. And that's where, for me, it kind of breaks down, and I don't have the answers. But for me, the two things are inextricable because of that. I don't know how to separate it out in my mind. I know that they are different, but somehow they're connected. So
yeah, I think a lot of us, especially who are coming to these topics for the first time, just looking back on your story, I mean, you're talking about a list of characters. You got the Greys, you got the kids. Got this Nordic guy that shows up. You've got wolves, this feminine entity, the Hat Man. You can't put any of this in one category. And I think the human response, especially for Christians, is like, we got to throw it all in one category. We can't have all these characters. It doesn't make sense. It's like, well, I mean, think about it in the chessboard. Satan's got his chess team trying to defeat God in this cosmic war. It's not just pawns.
Right.
He's got a whole list of characters that he's using. Because, I mean, on the back of your heart, it seems like every single time, no matter what happens, you're not in the right place. You're not where you should be.
Right.
You're not comfortable. Even though maybe some things are less or more, some things go away, your soul isn't at ease. Your soul isn't at peace.
Yeah. And that really was sort of the problem that ultimately became the plateau on which I stalled, because these entities, like I said in my email to you, and when you practice the occult, it becomes very apparent very quickly that there is this theme of continual sacrifice. And one of the things I kept running into was, this Jesus character. They didn't like it when I brought him into it, and some of them would react more positively than others, but it was always this, I knew in my heart that I was going to have to make a decision one way or the other. And so at that point, enter Blurry Creatures. So
Let me ask you one thing real quick. When you were at the height of this, did you consider yourself a witch?
No. I never gave myself that label. I understand that practically looking at the definition in the dictionary, I was definitely practicing witchcraft. But the way that I rationalized it to myself was, well, I didn't ask for these entities to start bugging me. I didn't ask for any of this. I'm just trying to harness what I have. And, again, it brings me back to that dream where I felt that bright light shining on me and just saying, obey me. Yeah. And it wasn't saying it in an angry way. I didn't feel the wrath, but what I felt was, you are known. You are completely known. And even so, you are, my child. And all I'm asking is that you obey me. And so, with each of these, little treats that these entities would give, or these like glimpses into the future, at each of those junction points, I had a choice. I could follow my heart which is what Hollywood would have you believe you ought to do at all times, or I could obey God. And depending on, where my heart was at the time, maybe following my heart would be obeying God in the moment, but my heart was so far from him because I was in disobedience. And so I followed my heart. I followed my destiny. I followed the vision.
I think that's such an important point too. I don't want to cut you off, but like, this is such a message that you will hear everywhere. Follow your heart, right? Follow your heart. And I think it's fascinating is that the Bible's very, very specific about saying the heart is the
deceitful.
The heart is deceitful, or the heart is the wellspring of evil, right? There's this idea that like, and in the messaging, and it's not an accident, right? Is follow your heart, you do you, self-love. And I'm not going to stand on a pedestal right now because I want you to continue your story, but remember, listeners, that those things are all the antithesis of the gospel. It's to die to ourselves. It's to pick up our cross daily. It's to resist the temptations of the flesh, right? And yet those are the messages. And listen, like what you're saying is those are the messages of the occult, or that's what you struggle. That's the occult telling you, like, in order to do X, Y, Z, you follow your heart, follow your destiny, right? These are the messages of the occult, and yet they are completely whitewashed, sanitized, and then sold to the masses here. And it's I always don't want to over spiritualize things, but it is a spell. It feels like it's put over the masses to say, oh, these are the ways. This is how you should live, right? And really, it's again, Nate and I say this all the time. It's just it's new marketing for the same lies,
exactly.
And so I'll let you continue because I think it's fascinating because you reach this precipice. I know that you, as you alluded to earlier, like in order to ascend in the occult, you have to denounce Christ, everything biblical. You essentially have to throw that off, and you never reached that point.
Yeah, I remember working through it with one of my friends and friend who did identify as a witch again. And I remember telling her, listen, I would love to continue down this path. But every time I hit a block or every time I'm attacked, the name of Jesus is the only thing that's working for me. And she said, well, you can have Jesus. You can have Jesus. Bring Jesus with you. I was just doing this psychic thing the other day. I was healing somebody long distance. It was like, I guess Reiki. And I needed an extra set of hands. And she proceeds to tell me, and she went into this story in detail, and she was telling me that she got Jesus in the room. And I remember realizing in the moment, no, I can't bring Jesus with me, because Jesus doesn't do that. He's not a gopher. He doesn't run to and fro assisting witches in healing ceremonies. And I think that for me, like, I just realized that I had been so blinded. And actually the moment of realization, because at this point you have to remember, I haven't had sleep paralysis at all. I thought I'd solved that problem. So I found Blurry Creatures. It was toward the end of last year, because I've only been a member for a few months now, or maybe
we're
half
grateful.
a year.
That was so good to have.
Thank you. I started listening, and unfortunately one of the first episodes I listened to was the episode with Tim Alberino, where he was talking about how a lot of abductions, people think they're stopping them, but they're actually waking up at the end. And I remember thinking, okay, I need to walk away. Like, this is too much. But then I found Vicky Joy's episode, and I listened to that thing probably 3 times because it opened my eyes and made me realize that I had been looking at the thing totally backwards. And not only that, but I don't know, there was something about listening to her. It was the Holy Spirit used that episode specifically to soften my heart. And around that time, I repented, and I burned my tarot decks, because of course I couldn't sell them. I'm dramatic like that. I had to burn them in a bonfire.
It has to be a big event.
Yeah,
I love that.
I wanted them to be gone, and I didn't want anybody else to possibly get their hands on them and get them. And so I burned all of, and I had probably 100 books. I had all sorts of like course materials. I had a lot of occult stuff that had to go, and I just did it. And I told God, I basically told God, I am not going to do divination anymore. And I'm actually going to go out of my way to not even look for signs. And I'm going to ask that you please come to me through your word or through your people, like somebody from church or your word or, a dream maybe, but I'll need you to back that up with scripture. Right. But yeah, I completely it was almost overnight. I just fell on my face before God and repented. And I mean, immediately, I knew I was forgiven. He never left me. I mean, he was there the whole time. And
isn't that his nature? Isn't that his nature? Yeah. That it's, well, so, so you really have this radical reconversion, right? You throw off and literally burn these materials, these decks, these tools of the occult. You burn them all. You give your life back to Christ. And so how does that affect like some of the, the things that had been regularly happening to you, like the appearance of entities, the appearance of like, does this stuff just cease? And do you, are you, how does that, because now you're filled with the Holy Spirit returns, right? Like, and you, well, not that he ever left, but it's like you give him back dominion over your life,
yes,
right? And
I surrendered to his will. And for the first time in my life, I finally realized that in that experience where I had felt him saying, obey me. And then that sense that he knew me completely and he knew everything about me. And even so,
come on,
he loved me. I was able to sort of unpack that a little bit more and realize, if I accomplish nothing else with my life, it is going to be living in obedience to God and his will for my life. And so after I had repented, I think I still wasn't a member of the show yet, but my sleep paralysis came back complete. Like it came back. These demonic entities, they were apparently angry, or the entities that had been protecting me from the lower level entities had withdrawn their protection, or whatever the case may be. The sleep paralysis kicked up, and it was, awful and terrifying, but as is the case in all of my experiences, as soon as I have the presence of mind to remember, what's going on, and to call on the name of Jesus. And there was kind of a shift there, because for a while I would sort of address the entities themselves and rebuke them in the name of Jesus. But now at this point, I just go directly to Jesus, because there's really no point in talking to them. So in fact, one night I have a cat, and I raised him. I found him on the side of the road when he was like a few weeks old. So
did he talk to you at all? Like Pickles?
I'm glad to report that he is mute mostly. But he was with me one night when I had a sleep paralysis episode, because I have fully brainwashed him into thinking that it's normal for cats to sleep all night, because I raised him. So
well done. Well done.
He is in the bed with me, and I had this sleep paralysis experience. And after I woke up, I sit up in my bed, I turn on my lamp, my kitten's there laying on me, and this sort of little black orb traveled across my room, over my bed, and out my window, and the cat tracked it with his eyes too. I would have thought that I was not seeing what I was seeing, but as with the case with the kid, I wasn't the only one seeing it. And so that happened after I had repented, and it's sort of quieted down little by little as time goes on. But it does still occur. One night, I guess the most significant one that happened recently, I was talking with somebody who's very close to me in my family, and they were dealing with an issue of sexual sin, and they were trying to break free. And I could hear in their voice that they really wanted to get out of this situation. And after we talked, I prayed over them, and I told God, please, if there is a spirit associated with this thing that they're not able to get away from, this thing that they're not able to escape, please drive that out of them. Please get that spirit, whatever it is, out of their life so that they can break free. And then I said something that I do not recommend anybody ever say, but I basically told God, if necessary, send that spirit here and I will face it with your strength. And I prayed the prayer. I sort of filed it away. The next day I got a phone call. This person had taken the final step to walk away from that situation. And I was very grateful, and there was much rejoicing. And I thought, okay, wonderful. The Lord answered my prayer. The Lord answered all of our prayers. And then that night I was in the astral. And it's not like I'm intentionally there. I don't know how I get there. And I was presented with this. I was standing in the woods, in a clearing in the woods, and I was presented with the suggestion that I could make this into a sensual dream. And I'm, once bitten, twice shy. I thought, nah. But I'm gonna see if sometimes in the astral you're on single player mode, but sometimes you're not. And then the other entities that are out there, they don't reveal that you're actually multiplayer until it's too late, until you've given permission. And so I was standing in the meadow and I'm thinking, well, I'm here. I'm fully in possession of my own mind. I'm going to just test and see how much control I have over this dream. And so into that dream, I made a kissing noise, like the sound of, kissing, giving someone a kiss on their cheek. And something about me participating to that degree apparently gave permission. It was like I succumbed to the temptation just enough. Immediately, I was thrown into my bed. I'm paralyzed. I'm on my bed. And this overwhelming sense of dread comes over me. And I hear the exact same kissing noise that I just made come from the corner of my room. And I see this demonic entity come spider crawling up to the side of my bed and just open its mouth and just unleash. I mean, there's no other way to describe it, but to unleash hell. It was so angry. And I remember in that moment just having this realization that this is very likely the demon that I was praying against, and told God that, to please drive it out of my very dear, close family member. And I don't know for sure, but I got the distinct impression that this thing was very angry at me in particular. And that was the last most significant event. Of course, every single time, I don't know that people talk about this a lot, but every single time you come out of sleep paralysis, you call on the name of Jesus, you beg him to please come and rescue you. And he does. You sit up in bed, you turn on the lamp, and sometimes the room isn't just immediately clear. When these things happen, I usually spend at least 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on how bad it was, just in worship. There's a lot of times when you can't help but just weep. And you're not only weeping because of how traumatic or terrifying the situation was, but you're also weeping with gratitude because you realize that you are just really nothing. You're only human, and we're playing on a chessboard that we were not, as we are right now with our present flesh, with our sin nature, with our weaknesses and our frailties. We're not built for this chessboard or to play on the level and in the dimensions that some of these entities can. But thank God that he's provided his son, and that, he is God, and, he created us. And I'm not implying that we're not capable of, rebuking these things. But when you are around these things and they are attacking you or they're coming at you, you just realize how little you are and how great is your need for a savior.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah. And I think what you raise is a good point. And I think that your experience in this last part of your interview is important for Christians to hear, because I think sometimes we think that, that Jesus is magic wand that we get to wave around and that these things are just always going to stop. I think Jesus delivers us, but I don't think that Christians aren't going to face demonic oppression. Just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you're not going to have this stuff coming at you all the time and messing with you. and you're going to deal with it,
Mm.
you know. And I think sometimes, you know, like I remember Luke and I had a long talk with Tim about this off air, about some things that he knows about, you know, how complicated these spiritual attacks can be sometimes.
Mm.
And how we have to constantly be going back to Christ and figuring out ways to continue to give it to him to fight these battles for us. And you can't, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean this thing's just naturally going to stop and leave you alone. Sometimes, like it sounds like sometimes it upticks. It comes at you a little bit more. The more offense you get, you know, in nature, the more this stuff doesn't want you to do it.
100%, right? Like the more that you're over the target, the more resistance you get. I mean, and I think this is an encouragement to everyone out there that is fighting the fight, right? The more that you are a threat to the kingdom of darkness, the more incentive the darkness has to come after you. I mean, they can't. And remember that the supernatural, spiritual realm, whatever you want to, whatever vernacular you want to use for that space, it is very much legalistic. So they have to obey the name of Jesus. But as Nate said, there are a lot of times there's complicated things that come into play. Joe, I love your story because I for someone that went there and back, right? And I think there's so many. I feel like there's 10 podcasts in there, right? Like each one of your experiences could have been a single podcast where we just unwrapped it all.
Yeah.
And you've been on a journey, and what I love the most is that God never gives up on us, and it doesn't matter how far we get into the weeds and the darkness. He doesn't give up, and the God we serve is in the business of redemption, and your story is that. It's a story of redemption. It's the prodigal son, right? Which we all are prodigals, right? And we've all gone and thrown our inheritance to the swines. But the amazing part of this is the Father is waiting with open arms for us to return. And I think there's just so much power in this testimony. And I want to just encourage you, because as much as we have free will and we make our own decisions, the amazing thing is that story that we have, each of our own individual stories, if we give our lives back to Christ and there's that redemption in all of our stories, God uses that. It's the idea, the biblical idea of that what was meant for evil is now used for good, right? And so that is what's happening here. So like you said, whether whatever you do with your life from here on out, this is your story, yours uniquely, and it is going to impact folks that you have no idea. Like I really believe this, that our testimonies and in our lives, people we interact with, that we'll end up in heaven someday, and we'll meet people that we never really met. That'll say your story, or this sort of haphazard thing you may have done, this act of kindness, this brought me to the Lord, right? And I believe that with my whole heart. And so I want to encourage you that your story not only matters, but it's going to help people, because you went to the precipice and across and returned, and you've since you pulled back the veil, you've seen the darkest of the darkness, and yet you choose Christ, right? And I just think, and He chose you as He chooses all of us, and I love that.
He never stopped pursuing me. And one thing that I think is important for people to think about is this idea that when I was in disobedience, when I was in rebellion, I didn't have the sleep paralysis. I didn't have the scary demonic attacks. I had euphoric experiences. I met these shining, shimmering entities. When I was in disobedience and rebellion, it was nothing but, the highs. Mostly, there was some scary stuff in there, but it was the positive, the things people describe when they take, substances and they have these euphoric experiences. It was when I began to repent that these things, the mask came off. And so as long as you're willing to play their game and to live in rebellion, there is a blindness that comes over you. You're complicit with the darkness, and you get to see them as these shiny, shimmering beings, or these motherly entities, or these, they give you the love that your perhaps father didn't give you, or whatever. But there's something about it that's so disingenuous, because when you speak the name of Jesus, or when you bring God into it, the mask slips. And so, when I repented, that's when the attacks would happen after, and so there's something to be explored there, not necessarily by me, but
no, but you make a great point biblically, right? The Bible says that the enemy masquerades as an angel of light.
Yeah. And if you are complicit, if you are willing to play that game with him, then he'll give you the good experiences. For sure. For sure.
But it's all as you said, I loved it. The poison is in the cup.
Oh yeah. Yeah. You can do manifestation rituals. You can have all the prophetic dreams you want and then chase them down and say, this is my destiny. But like I said, at every single juncture, you are presented with the choice to obey or to follow your own heart or you follow your own will. And so while you may be manifesting something that you think you want, you may get the cup, you may get that prize, but the poison comes with it. And so it's not for your good and it's not for God's glory. And, thank God that he was able to use these things to be a part of my redemption, because, some people continue to choose to run from him. And so, I'm incredibly grateful for your podcast because, before finding you guys, I didn't know about aliens. I didn't really know much about sleep paralysis. I certainly didn't, know a lot of stuff. And so through listening to the podcast and then becoming a member and listening to more of the podcast, it sort of has lent a perspective and a context for a lot of stuff. And now I realize how deceptive a game the enemy is playing. So
it's interesting. Your story is interesting because I think you came in from the back door in the sense that, some people are just trying their best, especially a lot of Christians right now, just to put into perspective what is happening with disclosure and what are these alien beings. And you're on the other end where you're trying to make sense of the experiences you've had with them. You've been in that realm and you're trying to get, what is this realm? What are these things? What are these experiences I've had? And then most people are just doubters. They struggle with doubt and they can't believe in the weird stuff out there because they haven't seen it themselves. And it's cool that the podcast from all angles, people who don't believe and want to believe, or people who want to figure out what they've experienced, can sort of find some answers through guys like Tim Alberino and Judd Burton and
Doug Van Dorn,
Doug Van Dorn and Laura Sanger.
All of them. Yeah. The whole crew.
The whole Blurry crew.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we appreciate it, and I think, when you grow up, you hear phrases like test the spirits. There's really that's a loaded thing. That means spirits are going to come to you. Spirits are going to try to deceive you. Spirits are going to, they're going to show up. And how do you test them? Ask them who are they loyal to? Who is their father? Do you serve Jesus Christ? And it sounds like the people on our show, when that happens, there's a reaction. It's hard to believe for a lot of Christians that you can actually get a moment where you could test a spirit. You could actually say, who are you? What team are you on?
Yeah, exactly.
What jersey are you wearing? What jersey you got on there?
Yeah.
That just sounds so fantastical to so many people. And you've been there. You've been in those moments where you could have and did. So thank you for sharing your story and coming on our podcast and opening up. Like Luke said, we could probably talk for hours about all these things you dropped on us. But
yeah,
I think it's a sort of a good sort of spread of your story and helps people, because a lot of people have had experienced one part of this, one shape or another, and we don't all get the blurry baptism like you had, but we get little pieces.
Yeah.
And it's hard to make sense of those little things.
Yeah. All together, it creates a very confusing casserole, and one that I may not fully understand this side of heaven, or any of us, but it is so encouraging to have at least some parts of the casserole identified. Because every time, you listen to a podcast or
That's gonna be a meme on our members group.
So 80s. Who didn't have every type of casserole under the sun?
I just see
or in the Midwest, right?
Someone's gonna post
Midwest, right? It's casserole. I love it.
There's gonna be all the weird stuff in a pie. I can just already see it on the members group.
Bigfoot's in there. Yeah.
We'll give you credit.
Yeah.
This is
the
cryptid
casserole.
Yeah, the cryptid
and
casserole.
I just want to thank you guys and encourage you. Like I'm everything that I have said here today sounds incredibly insane. I know, and nobody in my family knows this stuff really. I have a whole life where none of this really. I have this very strong faith in Jesus, and I'll talk about him and how he saved me. But, really, truly, I was thinking about this, from now on, when I give my testimony, if I don't name drop Blurry Creatures, I'm not doing.
Let's go.
Wow. I'm not giving the whole story, so.
Well, thank you. That is completely humbling. So we are,
yeah.
I think honestly, at the end of the day, like, we're just glad that you're back in the family. And, if God can use this little vehicle, then we just want him to use it and get us out of the way. Right. And that's really our heart. And so I just thank you for this and for the story and for the encouragement, and just say how grateful we are for your story and how grateful we are to have you back in the family, per se, that I'm continually amazed at the graciousness and of God and what his never-ending pursuit of us, and the way that he can use all the broken parts and put them back together to make something
absolutely
beautiful.
And thank you guys for what you do. As long as God has you here, I wanted you guys to know, like, you are reaching people, and like I said in my email, you're a light shining out into the darkness, and you will probably not know the depth and the breadth, how far that light has pierced this side of heaven.
This side of heaven.
But thank you, and appreciate what you guys do.
Thank you.
We'll see you in the Blurry verse.
Oh, yeah.
We'll see you out there.
Right.
Yeah,
and I think Blurry Creatures more and more as it goes on is a collective of all the people who've taken the chance to go against the narrative, all the guests, all the people who have taken a risk and a chance to say that that there's parts of the story that we're not talking about. Every single guest on our show, and I think in some ways it's just a big old bus of people who are like willing to go down that road, and we're just two guys in the back somewhere making jokes and trying to not take ourselves too seriously, but we take your story seriously and everyone else who comes on the show seriously, and we give people, hey, just it's your chance to tell your story. And some people love that, and some people get mad at us about it, but I think that ultimately it's the people and the guests who make this show what it is. It's your story that helps make this show what it is. And I don't know, I think Luke and I are just, hey, we got tired of people not willing to listen to other people. And
if there's one person out there who hears anything that I've said today and they've also experienced that, and if anything resonates, then I'll consider that I haven't just totally bared everything.
No, hey, listen,
it's crazy, but there are people out there who have these experiences, and if you guys hadn't had a podcast, then I would still be very much thinking, like, what's going on? I'm alone in this. So
no, we're in the same boat. We're on the same way, because I think if we, the idea that one person found their way to Christ because of the time that we spend, on these microphones and talking about stuff, that makes it eternally worth it, right? And so, that's the reason you want to do anything, and so you know what? You're going to reach people. Yeah, I believe there's we talk about destiny. There's a destiny over your life, and I really believe that your story is going to be a part of that. So I want to encourage you in that. Again, thank you for being a member. Thank you for being on the show and spending a couple hours with us. And, thanks for taking a risk. It's a risk, as you mentioned, it's a risk to get out there and tell your story and kind of bare your soul to a couple strangers and Nate and I, and then also, a bunch of other folks that listen. But man, God is gonna bless that. So we're excited to see what happens with your story and how. Yeah, we'll check in and see how.
Yeah, you might have some weird horse breeders reaching out to you.
You're like, hey, what can you make for us?
No. I'm gonna have to
be like, no, that's not what you want.
We want a star. Field those emails.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like when we were kids in the 80s, My Little Pony was such a big deal, and you're like, you have no idea. My Little Pony.
Oh, man.
Like Mike Heiser says, if it's weird, it's important. There's something going on there, and we have no idea. We have no idea. We're really often what's going on out there, and every story helps shed the light a little bit, and not to make a joke, but I don't doubt the experiences that our listeners have one bit. I'm more just humbled and trying to make sense of it all. So thanks.
Yes.
Again
Yeah.
for coming
Thank
on.
you guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. All right.
I'll see you around.